The dopaminergic system, responsible for motivation and reward expectation, reduces its activity. The brain literally stops rewarding certain behaviors. At the same time, areas linked to risk assessment and self-perception increase their activity, generating a diffuse feeling of alertness, doubt, and unease. The individual doesn't understand the reason, but they feel it. You feel like something doesn't fit anymore. You feel that continuing as you are requires an effort that didn't exist before. You feel a weariness that isn't physical, it's existential. And here arises the first great illusion that this state is a mistake to be corrected. In reality, this is the state that precedes almost all profound changes in human life. The brain, realizing that old patterns no longer provide emotional security, begins to slowly dismantle them. However, this process is not conscious. It happens below the line of rational thought, and therefore it is experienced as confusion. This is the point where many people back down. They try to artificially restore what no longer works. They return to relationships that have already died, insist on roles that exhaust them, seek distractions to silence the discomfort. They don't realize they are fighting against a natural process of internal reorganization. What is most unsettling is that this state is often accompanied by a paradoxical feeling. While everything seems unstable, there is a strange sense that something important is about to happen, although still without form, without a name, without a clear direction. The brain knows before consciousness, and that's exactly where the deeper conflict begins, because the rational mind wants immediate answers. But the brain works silently, preparing for a rupture that cannot yet be explained. And the question that begins to form, albeit vaguely, is always the same. What if the problem isn't tiredness, but the life I'm leading? When the brain enters this state of silent reorganization, something curious happens. Fear appears even in the absence of a concrete threat. There is no visible danger. There is no explicit crisis. Nothing, objectively speaking, seems to justify the discomfort. Still, the anxiety grows. This is one of the most misunderstood phenomena of human experience. People believe that fear always arises as a response to something external. A real risk, an imminent loss, a situation of instability. But, in the moments preceding major internal changes, fear is born from another source. The unconscious anticipation of the unknown. The human brain is designed to preserve continuity. It prefers the predictable to the healthy, the familiar to the safe. From a neurological point of view, what is known consumes less energy than what requires adaptation. And for the brain, energy conservation is synonymous with survival. When old circuits begin to lose strength, the brain interprets this as a threat to the system's stability. It doesn't matter if current life is frustrating, limited, or emotionally impoverished. If it's known, it's predictable, and predictability means control. It is at this moment that the limbic system, especially the amygdala, comes into play. She doesn't ask if the change is good. She only asks, is this safe? And since there is no clear answer, the body reacts. Restlessness arises without apparent cause, a tightness in the chest at the end of the day, the feeling of being behind in one's own life, the urge to run away without knowing exactly from what. Many people interpret this as a sign that something is wrong with them. They seek distraction, excessive busyness, constant stimulation. Others resort to relationships, consumption, compulsive work, or even illness, just to silence this internal noise. But what is actually happening is a conflict between two systems. On one side, the old brain, which wants to preserve what is familiar. On the other hand, there are more recent circuits linked to identity and meaning, which have already realized that the current structure no longer supports who the person is becoming. This conflict generates a paradoxical emotional state. The person feels too uncomfortable to remain where they are, but too insecure to move forward. It is the middle ground, a territory that most try to cross as quickly as possible, or else ignore, numb, repress. But it is precisely in this space that the greatest transformations occur. The problem is that the brain offers no guarantees. It doesn't show what comes next. It only signals that the old model has lost its validity. And for a mind accustomed to control, that is deeply disturbing. That is why, at this stage, recurring thoughts arise such as, "Nothing makes sense anymore. It seems like I'm lost. Before, I knew who I was. Something in me has changed, but I don't know what." These thoughts are not symptoms of a breakdown. They are signs of transition. What most people don't realize is that the brain only enters this state when an internal structure has already been exhausted. It's not the beginning of the decline. It's the silent end of a phase that had been artificially sustained. And the more a person tries to force a return to what it was before, the more intense the discomfort becomes. Because when the brain decides to change, it doesn't ask for permission. He just starts disconnecting the old circuits. And then comes the question that almost no one dares to formulate clearly. What if this unease isn't a problem, but a warning? Mystias, there is a moment, almost imperceptible, when a person is no longer who they were, but they don't yet know who they are becoming. It is during this interval that the suffering intensifies. The human brain doesn't just become attached to people, routines, or environments. Above all, it becomes attached to identities, the idea of who we are, the role we occupy, the image we have built of ourselves over the years. This identity functions as a psychological anchor. It provides predictability, coherence, and a sense of continuity. The problem is that when the internal structure begins to change, this identity becomes too narrow. The individual begins to feel that they are playing a role that no longer describes them. Choices that once seemed natural now require effort. The decisions that guided them begin to sound hollow. There's a strange feeling of living a life that technically is yours, but emotionally no longer belongs to you. And this creates a deep conflict, because abandoning an identity isn't just about changing habits. It's about accepting the symbolic death of a version of yourself. From a neurological point of view, this process is experienced as a real threat. The same brain regions activated in the face of emotional loss or social rejection become active. The brain reacts as if something essential were being ripped away. That's why many people resist. They cling to relationships that no longer make sense. They maintain careers that drain their energy. They defend opinions they no longer believe in. They maintain routines that make them sick, not out of conviction, but out of fear of the emptiness that comes after. The brain prefers an uncomfortable identity to no identity at all. And it is at this point that one of the most subtle mechanisms of self-sabotage emerges: the attempt to prove to oneself that one is still the same. The person forces old behaviors, relives patterns, tries to feel what they no longer feel, and the more they try, the more distant they feel from themselves. This process is often accompanied by a feeling that is difficult to name, a kind of grief without an object. It is not known exactly what has been lost, but something is clearly gone. What few realize is that this mourning is not for the past. It's for a future that has yet to unfold. The brain knows that a reorganization is underway, but consciousness is not yet able to formulate what will come next. This creates a feeling of suspension, as if life were on pause. This is the point at which many people mistakenly conclude that they are regressing. In reality, they are going through one of the most delicate moments of psychological maturity. The moment when the old identity ceases to serve, but the new one has not yet taken shape. This interval is silent. It doesn't generate applause, it offers no certainties, and it is almost never socially validated. But it has an essential function: to dismantle the structures that no longer support who the person is becoming. The problem is that without understanding this, the individual begins to fight against the process itself, and the more they fight, the more they suffer. Then, albeit timidly, an uncomfortable question arises, which is usually quickly stifled. What if I'm not lost in, but rather caught between different versions of myself? When identity begins to crumble and the brain enters this intermediate state, a silent chemical phenomenon takes over much of the suffering: dopaminergic instability. Dopamine is often associated with pleasure, but that's a dangerous oversimplification. In reality, it's linked to anticipation. It is the expectation of reward, the feeling that something ahead is worth the current effort. It is what sustains the movement, the motivation, the sense of direction. When the brain realizes that old pathways no longer produce emotional returns, dopamine release decreases. What once generated stimulation now generates neutrality or even repulsion. The problem is that the new pathways don't yet exist enough to activate this system. The result is a chemical vacuum. The person feels less enthusiasm, less drive, less clarity, not because they are ill, but because the brain is transitioning between two reward systems. And this transition is not comfortable. This is when the anxiety intensifies, not as fear of something specific, but as a diffuse state of unease. The brain, without a clear source of dopamine, goes into vigilance mode. It looks for signs of danger, mistakes, threats, even when nothing concrete is happening. The mind begins to spin in circles. Repetitive thoughts arise. The future seems uncertain. Simple decisions become exhausting. And then the brain's most efficient saboteur comes into play, the return to the familiar. At this stage, the individual begins to feel an almost automatic urge to revert to old patterns, not because they are beneficial, but because they offer predictability. The brain prefers familiar suffering to unknown uncertainty. That's why so many people, just when they're about to change, back down. They rekindle strained relationships. They accept less than they deserve. They postpone important decisions. They convince themselves that they were exaggerating. And they do this believing they are being prudent, when in reality they are merely obeying a mechanism of self-preservation in the brain. This process is silent and extremely convincing. The brain creates rational narratives to justify retreat. Now is not the time. Maybe I'm being impulsive. It's better to keep what I have. I can deal with that later. What he doesn't reveal is that this impulse doesn't come from reason, but from a primal fear of losing his bearings. At this point, many people confuse anxiety with intuition. They believe that discomfort is a sign that something is wrong, when in fact it is a sign that something is changing. The difference is subtle but decisive. The anxiety that arises before change doesn't point to real danger. It points to the end of an internal structure that has already served its purpose. The brain, realizing it can no longer sustain the old model, attempts one last maneuver, convincing the individual to remain exactly where they are. And this is where most of the dropouts occur, not for lack of ability, not for lack of opportunity, but because discomfort along the way is interpreted as a warning to retreat, when in fact it's the opposite. And the question that begins to form, albeit uncomfortably, is, how many times have I confused fear of change with intuition? There is one aspect of this process that is rarely discussed, but which exerts a decisive influence. The social environment was not built to accommodate profound internal transformations. On the contrary, society functions best when people remain predictable. When they repeat roles, maintain routines, and uphold stable identities, social, economic, and emotional systems depend on this continuity, and therefore, anything that threatens profound change tends to be subtly discouraged, not explicitly, but through expectations, norms, and invisible rewards. When someone enters that quiet state that precedes a turning point, those around them usually react with surprise. Friends notice that the person is different. Family asks what's going on. Work demands the same performance as always. The world in general expects consistency, not transformation, and this pressure acts directly on the brain. Humans are deeply sensitive to social approval. Brain areas linked to physical pain are activated when we feel rejection or disapproval. Evolutionarily, this made sense. Being excluded from the group meant risk of death. The modern brain still retains this mechanism. Therefore, when someone begins to change internally but still cannot explain why, a devastating conflict arises. Following one's own process means running the risk of disappointing, frustrating, or letting down others. And often, the person chooses to back down, not because they want to, but because they fear the emotional cost of change. Society subtly reinforces this by praising stability, constancy, and predictability. People who change too much are seen as confusing. Those who question too much are labeled ungrateful. Those who transform themselves without a clear justification cause discomfort. Thus, the individual learns to doubt themselves. He begins to interpret his internal state as a mistake. He believes he should be satisfied, that he should feel grateful, that he should adapt. And little by little, she begins to silence her own discomfort. The problem is that this silencing doesn't erase the process. It only pushes it to deeper layers of the mind. The body continues to feel. The brain continues trying to reorganize patterns. But now everything happens under tension. This is how burnout, chronic anxiety, and existential apathy arise. Not because the person is weak, but because they are living out of sync with an internal reorganization that has been interrupted. What's most unsettling is that often the exact moment of the turning point goes unnoticed. The person feels that something almost happened, but can't quite put their finger on what. And they move on, carrying a vague feeling that they left something important behind. Only years later, when he looks back, does he realize that that period of quiet unease was in fact a threshold, a turning point, a rare moment when the brain was ready to abandon an old structure, but was prevented by fear, pressure, or the need to fit in. And then a difficult reflection arises. How many versions of myself have I abandoned in order to continue belonging? There comes a point when resistance gives way, not because the fear disappeared, not because everything became clear, but because maintaining the old ways requires more energy than moving into the unknown. This moment is not usually dramatic. It doesn't come with euphoria, nor with cinematic revelations. Most of the time, it arrives discreetly, almost mundanely. It is the moment when a person realizes with silent clarity that they can no longer pretend that nothing has changed. The brain, after weeks or months of internal reorganization, begins to stabilize new circuits. Dopamine, previously erratic, finds new targets. Anxiety decreases not because the problems have disappeared, but because the internal conflict is resolved. The mind stops fighting against the process. It's important to understand something fundamental here. The journey is not about achieving a new ideal version of yourself. It is, more often than not, a loss of illusions, loss of old expectations, loss of the need to please, loss of an image that was sustained more by habit than by truth. When the brain completes this cycle, it doesn't offer immediate enthusiasm. It offers something more subtle, internal coherence. The person begins to feel less noise, less need to explain themselves, less urgency to prove something. There's a kind of functional silence that settles in. It's not emptiness, it's alignment. And it is at this point that many are surprised. External life may continue practically the same, but the internal experience changes radically. The same situations no longer generate the same impact. The same pressures lose their strength. The same fear no longer governs decisions. This happens because the brain stops operating from a defensive perspective and starts operating from an integrative perspective. Change, when it truly happens, isn't noisy. She is stable. What once seemed confusing now makes sense in retrospect. That period of restlessness, apathy, and estrangement, it all reveals itself as a process of profound reorganization, not as a mistake. And perhaps the most difficult aspect to accept is this. Most people get very close to that point, but they back down. He retreats out of fear. It retreats due to pressure. She retreats because she doesn't understand what's happening inside herself. Few remain in the discomfort long enough to cross over, because crossing over requires enduring the void without trying to fill it. It requires tolerating uncertainty without seeking anesthesia. It requires accepting that the brain sometimes needs to dismantle entire structures before building something more coherent. And that is why this state, the one that precedes the biggest turning point in life, is so misunderstood. It doesn't look like growth, it looks like loss. But in reality, it's the exact moment when the brain stops protecting who you were, to allow something more genuine to begin to emerge. And the question that remains perhaps the most uncomfortable of all is not about the future, it's about the present. Are you trying to escape this state, or are you ready to cross it?